I'm Rebecca Robertson, President and Executive Producer of Park Avenue Armory. Welcome to the second recorded talk in the 2021 Malkin Lecture Series. All 4 lectures offered this year will be available on our website at armoryonpark.org. Today's talk comes to you from the Armory's magnificent Veterans Room. The lecture you are about to hear is by Catherine Grace Katz and focuses on 3 young women who attended the Yalta Conference of 1945 with their fathers, Anna Roosevelt, Kathleen Harriman, the daughter of the U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Sarah Churchill. The Harrimans and Roosevelts had deep connections to the Armory. Many of the men were 7th Regiment members, and the families hosted many functions here. Anna Roosevelt and Kathleen Harriman, along with Sarah Churchill, were no strangers to international politics and power, as you will learn from Catherine Grace Katz, who is the author of The Daughters of Yalta, which the Wall Street Journal calls an extraordinary work that reveals the human side underlying the politics. So let us all give a good welcome to Catherine Grace Katz.
Hello, thank you so much to the Park Avenue Armory for having me today. I'm thrilled to be able to share the story of the Daughters of Yalta with you. I'd love to begin this presentation with a photograph that may be very familiar to some of you. This photograph is one of the most famous of World War II. It's one of the few that we have of the big 3, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin all together. And it was taken at Levatia Palace at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. You can see behind them they have their generals lined up, and each of them looks very exhausted and a bit tense. They're reached a point in the war where it looks like finally the war in Europe is going to be drawing to a close sometime in the late spring or early summer. And with the end of the war in Europe, it brings about many challenges to address. And this is the reason that they've all come to Yalta to meet and discuss. First, they need to lay some plans for the end of the war in Germany. Should Germany be allowed to remain one country, or should it be broken up into a group of smaller states in hopes that they can't rise up as a belligerent for a 3rd time in half a century? Also incredibly important, especially to Winston Churchill, is the future of Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset, and the Polish government has been in exile in London ever since. Churchill doesn't want to return home from Yalta and look his Polish colleagues in the eye and say they were not able to secure that which they went to defend in the first place. Stalin, meanwhile, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. The Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before has long been paranoid about security on its borders and the vulnerabilities of the flatlands of Poland through which they've been invaded multiple times, going all the way back to the Napoleonic era. So Stalin wants to make sure that when all of this is over, after all the sacrifices of the Red Army, that they have friendly neighbors, as he calls it, on their borders, so that they will not be invaded again in the future. Roosevelt, meanwhile, has his focus a little bit more oriented to the Pacific, where the war is not quite as advanced. At this point, the Iwo Jima has not yet happened. We don't yet know if the atomic bomb will be a success. And so he's looking at the potential need for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. Roosevelt wants to save as many American lives as possible, and so the way he wants to do this is by bringing the Soviet Union into the fight against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions. This, of course, leads to some other issues with Stalin, but that's a story that we'll get to later. His other objective at this point is he wants to create a peace organization of United Nations. This he sees as his lasting legacy, where he can succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed and bring together a mechanism for, if not eternal peace, as that's probably a bit foolhardy to think, but at least peace in Europe for 50 years. He also sees this Organization of United Nations as a way of bringing the Soviet Union into the international community when the war is over and the common enemy has been defeated. So these are just a few of the issues up for debate at Yalta, and gives a little bit more context for why they all look so exhausted and have these grimaces on their faces. The other thing that I didn't realize entirely until I began the research for this book was just what it took to get to Yalta. If you think about the kinds of security and preparation that goes into grand summits today between world leaders, no advanced team would ever allow their principals to make the kind of journey that these leaders made to get to Yalta to meet with Stalin. At this point in the war, Stalin recognizes that he holds more cards than do his allies. If they want his cooperation, they're going to have to come to him. He's paranoid about security and refuses to leave his own borders, so the farthest west he's willing to go is the Crimea. This means that Churchill first has to fly 1,300 miles to Malta, where he'll rendezvous with FDR. But very tragically on the way, one of the planes carrying members of the British Foreign Office crashes off the coast of Italy, and several people are killed, which really casts a shadow over the beginning of this conference for the British. Roosevelt, meanwhile, has to make a week-long journey by ship across the Atlantic Ocean in a destroyer convoy, and they're still sighting enemy U-boats on the way, so this is not at all safe. Once they arrive in Malta, the two, Roosevelt and Churchill, will have to fly a further almost 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands, where there are anti-aircraft units shooting at planes that fly along at low altitude. One of the planes in the advance team headed to the Yalta Conference actually did have its tail shot, so you can imagine this is quite a dangerous undertaking. And then once they arrive in the Crimea, they land at an airfield that is far too short for the kinds of planes they fly, at an airfield that is covered in fog. And then they have to drive a further 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, until they finally arrive at Levatia Palace. Levatia Palace was once the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and it really was a family home and a retreat away from the pressures of court life, where the Tsar and his children would swim, they would play tennis, go horseback riding. But of course, all of this changed in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. The Romanov family was brutally murdered, the Soviets took over, and of course they also took over Levatia Palace, and they turned this once regal estate into a rest home for Soviet workers. This changed once again when the war broke out and the Nazis invaded the Crimea, and they took over Levatia Palace and used it as their Crimean headquarters. Several months before the Yalta Conference, the Soviets pushed the Nazis out, but not before the Nazis could take with them absolutely everything that they could carry. They stripped the palace of all of its furniture, the lamps, the dishes, the art, the rugs, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could strip out and use as scrap metal. So the Soviets have just 3 weeks from the time the three delegations agree that this is where they're going to meet to restock this villa and turn it into a site that is fit for the type of meeting and the place of world history that it will occupy. This entails taking the contents of grand hotels like Hotel Metropole in Moscow and carting the contents by train 1,000 miles south and using conscripted laborers to put it all back together again as quickly as possible. However, even though the Soviets were able to evict the Nazis in time, they could not evict another sort of critter that was there. This is bed bugs, which are throughout the palace. They spray everything in DDT, which we now know was not a great idea, but that was their solution at the time. However, it was to little effect. The Soviets also have a few other types of bugs throughout the palace and the grounds, as I'm sure you can imagine, and if you're in the Soviet Union, there's always someone listening. So this is the type of environment these three world leaders and all of their delegations and advisors will come to, and where they will hammer out the details for the end of the war. So that gives a little bit more context again for why they look the way they do, the pressures that abound, and the setting behind this photograph. But what I also find so remarkable about this picture is when you look at it in combination with another. There's another photograph taken of the exact same scene from a slightly different angle, just a few moments apart. And in this picture, you can see two young women off to the side. This is, you can see Sarah Churchill, who's 30 years old, the daughter of the Prime Minister, and Kathleen Harriman, who is the 27-year-old daughter of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Avril Harriman. Just outside the frame of this picture is Anna Roosevelt, FDR's 38-year-old daughter. She's also captured on newsreel footage of this same scene. And I had never seen this photograph before in all the time that I had studied the Yalta Conference, and had no idea that these three women had been present at the conference. And these brought to mind several questions. First, of all the people that these leaders could have brought with them to serve as their aides at one of the most important moments in world history on this precipice between World War and Cold War, what was so unique about the experiences and skills and abilities of their daughters that made them the perfect partners to serve as their aides in this moment in history? And second, we tend to think of Churchill and Roosevelt and even Harriman as these larger-than-life figures who we put on a pedestal to the extent that they almost become more than human and very hard to reconcile and kind of recognize within the context of our own lives as a person that you could meet on the street, or maybe not the president, but at the end of the day, I realized they're also someone's dad. And what would it be like to be their child and to be in this moment with your father? And these are questions that really stayed with me and began to guide my research and crafting of the narrative of this story. Before I introduce you further to the three daughters that are at the heart of this book, I want to introduce you to someone else. This is me in third grade, and I think it was pretty clear from the time I was a little kid that I loved history, and that would be my passion for many years to come. I grew up in a family of readers. I loved movies like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape, all great stories from World War II. And I used to chase my grandfather around at Thanksgiving with a pad of paper and a pen and asking him to tell me his stories about growing up during the Depression and serving as an officer in the Navy during the war. But I was also really fortunate where I grew up just north of Chicago in Winnetka, Illinois, that there was a huge emphasis put on history and understanding local history and the world around us and how it had evolved. So we had the chance as third graders to go and live like pioneer students for a day and imagine what third graders would have lived like, more than 100 years ago. Literally put ourselves into the shoes of people who came before us, attend a pioneer school day, cook a pioneer meal, and this sense of literally putting yourself in the shoes of the people who came before you was something that really stayed with me, and I think is something that I try to remember as I go about telling the stories of history now. I think it came as a surprise to no one that when I went to college, I became a history major. This is the morning that I turned in my senior thesis at Harvard, and I had 125 books checked out from the library, which my roommate thought was hilarious, so she decided we had to take a picture. I ended up writing my thesis about British prisoner of war escape narratives, which was inspired by my love of The Great Escape from the time I was a little kid. And what I didn't realize when I began this project was that Winston Churchill actually wrote the first of what we think of as these stories of escape. He was 24 years old when he escaped from a Boer POW camp during the Boer War in 1899, and it was the thrilling tale of his adventure that really rocketed him to fame in Britain and launched his political career. So here I spent this time with Churchill that I had not anticipated, and then I had the opportunity to do something that I wanted to do since I was a little kid, and that was go to Cambridge in England and pursue my master's in history as well. For a historian, there's no better place to be than Cambridge, where history just surrounds you all the time. And here, once again, I found myself unexpectedly spending quite a lot of time with Winston Churchill. This time, I was studying early counterintelligence practices in Britain during World War I and a postal censorship program that they used to try to find enemy spies who might be in their midst. The person overseeing this was the British Home Secretary, who happened to be none other than Winston Churchill. So I spent 2 years with a lot of Churchill on the brain, but at the time when I was done with Cambridge, I thought this is probably the end of the road for me in history. I'm going to go to New York, and like so many of my friends, decided to become a financial analyst and traded in the beautiful pastoral idyllic Cambridge for the hustle and bustle and energy of New York City. But what I was to quickly find was that I was wrong, that I wasn't quite done with history, nor with Winston Churchill, because in the lobby of my office in Midtown was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, named after Churchill's country home. This bookstore specialized in books by and about Winston Churchill. And I found myself on afternoons when I'd go down to the lobby to get a coffee that I'd wander into the bookstore and strike up conversation with the owner and chat about all things related to history. Before long, he suggested that I should meet the International Churchill Society, which happened to be having a dinner just across the street from my office with Madeleine Albright as a keynote speaker. I was very excited at the prospect of hearing from Secretary Albright, who's somebody I had admired for a long time. And so off I went to this dinner and met the International Churchill Society, which is made up of scholars and academics and professionals of all walks of life that want to encourage people to study history and go into public service and leadership, much like Churchill. At the dinner, I was also fortunate enough to meet several members of the Churchill family. And shortly thereafter, I learned that they were opening the papers of Churchill's middle daughter, Sarah, to researchers for the first time. And the society asked if I'd be interested in writing an article about them for their magazine. I said, yes, I would love to do this. I was applying to law school at the time, but thought that it would be just a fun way to do some writing and stay engaged with the history that I loved. And little did I know that this would quickly turn into something much bigger. But one of the reasons that I was so excited to take on this project was because I had had a small experience of sorts with Sarah Churchill from the time I was a little girl. If people today know Sarah Churchill, it's often that she had been an actress and a dancer, and she even starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. However, I quickly began to realize she was much more than this. The Sarah that I had been introduced to initially as a little girl was from this photograph, which hung on the wall of the cloister in Sea Island, Georgia, where my family has been going ever since I was a little kid. Each summer, I would walk past this beautiful picture of the Prime Minister's daughter on her wedding day. She had eloped to Sea Island in 1949. And here I found myself with the opportunity to really learn more about her life. And I was quickly struck not so much by her career as an actress, which, while very glamorous and exciting, paled in comparison to her experiences during World War II and her relationship with her father. From the time Sarah was a little girl, she felt that she could understand the way that her father's mind worked better than just about anyone else in the world. She said that she could walk in silent step with him, understanding what he was thinking even before he said it aloud himself, or if he chose to keep it silent, that she could interpret his thoughts and feelings. Much of this came from the hours that she spent with him in the garden of their home at Chartwell while he was engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, which was bricklaying. He would do this to relax, and Sarah would be out there in the garden with him as his helper, his second mate, and she'd keep the plumb line straight, mix the cement, hand him bricks, and they'd have hours of conversation and quiet solitude together. And this really laid the foundation for them that would see them through the next number of years in ways that Sarah never could have expected at the time. Sarah was also very much like her father in the sense that she wanted to make her own way in the world on her own terms. She didn't think at the time, as many women would not have thought then, that she could follow her father into politics, even though she certainly could have succeeded in this. And there are very few careers or educational opportunities beyond a teenage level for a woman of Sarah's position. And so Sarah decided that one of the few things that she might do was become an actress. For some parents, this might have been incredibly scandalous, but for Winston Churchill, I think he was a bit broken in by his own mother. His mother was the American debutante, Jenny Jerome, who was a bit of an unusual character in her own times. She was rumored to have had a snake tattooed around her wrist and to have had scores of lovers. So by comparison, I think Sarah wanting to be an actress was quite tame. Sarah did become an actress, but very quickly fell in love with the star of her show, a man named Vic Oliver, who was Austrian. Winston and Clementine were very concerned about this, but Sarah decided to elope with him. Churchill was concerned mostly because of his Austrian citizenship, that if the winds of war, which seemed to be brewing on the continent, really became stronger and war did break out, how might this leave Sarah? Fortunately, she didn't have to answer that question because, unfortunately, their marriage broke down rather quickly. And this coincided with the beginning of the war and Sarah's father becoming prime minister. Sarah decided that she could do her bit for her country and find this freedom and sense of purpose that she desired by joining the women's branch of the Royal Air Force as a WAF in the Military Reconnaissance Intelligence Unit, where she would look at photos that had been taken by recon pilots thousands of feet in the sky and make intelligence assessments based on them. She would look at the ships that were in enemy harbors and try to interpret what type of ships they were by the kind of shadow that they cast. She would look at photographs of fields where the grass had been trampled and deduce whether that was because of an enemy troop movement or because of some cows that happened to be grazing. She was also very intimately familiar with the details of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And sometimes she knew the details of these operations even better than her father. One day she came home for a dinner while the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, was visiting, and she and her father had a little chat about Operation Torch, and he realized how much she knew. And so at dinner that night, he decided to brag about her and how well she was doing in her work to Eleanor Roosevelt, including specific details of the operation she was working on. Eleanor Roosevelt was similarly impressed and went and told the newspapers in an interview about Sarah's work. The next day, Sarah found herself hauled in front of her superiors. They asked her, who told the First Lady and the press about all the details of this operation? And Sarah could only say, it was my father. So there was not much they could do. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine Churchill had decided that when the Prime Minister traveled abroad, someone from the family should go with him as a protector and confidant of sorts. So when it came time for the Tehran Conference in 1943, the first time Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met to lay the plans for D-Day, Winston Churchill decided to bring Sarah as his aide, and for a number of reasons, she was the ideal choice. As an actress, she was actually incredibly well-suited to diplomacy. There's much that's very similar about diplomacy and acting, where you have to give nuanced messages, leave things unsaid and yet interpreted in certain ways, read the room, all of these things which she was very good at doing because of her skills as an actress. As an officer in the military, she was also very familiar with the actual military operations at hand that were the reason that they were all there to meet. She also was a beautiful writer, and this was very important because Winston Churchill wanted to write his wartime memoirs when it was all over, just as he had done after the First World War. And Sarah's letters that she wrote home to her mother could help capture details that were unfolding at this conference beyond what was happening officially in the conference negotiation sessions, to capture the character and the color and really the soul of everything that was transpiring. But finally, it was because Sarah truly understood her father and the way that his mind worked. Things could go between them unsaid, but she understood him perfectly. And for all these reasons, she was the ideal choice. She was so successful as a daughter diplomat in this environment that pretty soon several other fathers began to take notice. Two of these were FDR and Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman is someone who will probably be familiar to many New Yorkers for a variety of reasons, not least because he was governor, but before that he was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, owned part of Newsweek magazine, had investments in manganese mines and shipping conglomerates all around the world, and he also founded Sun Valley, which was the first glamorous American ski resort. Averell Harriman had two daughters, Mary and Kathleen, and he wasn't especially close to his daughters when they were little girls, as he was always off chasing business deals and opportunities, and he and his wife had divorced when they were young. It was only when their mother died that Averell Harriman really came back into their lives. For his daughter Kathleen, who was a teenager at the time, this really began to transform her life in ways that she never could have imagined. He wrote to his daughters and said, "I know that I am not a warm and fuzzy father by any means, but I believe that we could become the best and finest of friends." And he invited his daughters to come and participate in his world of business to whatever extent that it interested them, in a way that was very ahead of their time. His daughter Kathleen jumped at the chance to join him in his world. Much like him, she was adventurous and athletic. She was an expert equestrian, a crack shot, and also an Olympic-level skier. She and Averell Harriman really formed the beginnings of a partnership in Sun Valley, where Kathleen chose to work with him during his school vacations, serving as his right-hand man, working on publicity, marketing, attending to VIP guests like Ernest Hemingway, and even doing a bit of recon on neighboring resorts that began to pop up. In the early 1940s, Averell Harriman had left his career in business largely behind and had been spending a few years working in the New Deal administration with Roosevelt, and he formed a very close friendship with Harry Hopkins. When the war broke out in Britain and FDR was still maintaining a neutral stance for the United States, he wanted to help in whatever way the United States could, and so he devised the Lend-Lease program. He needed someone to go over to London at the beginning of 1941 to oversee this program, and with Harry Hopkins' recommendation, he chose to send Averell Harriman. Off Harriman went to London, and once he arrived there, he quickly realized this would be a great opportunity for my 23-year-old daughter to come with me in the middle of the Blitz and become a war reporter. Kathleen jumped at this chance to have this adventure with her father at his side in the middle of the war, and she arrived just after the worst bombing that London had experienced. Kathleen and Averell became very close friends with the Churchill family in the time that they lived in London. Some of you may be very familiar with the story of Averell and one particular Churchill, this one being Pamela, who struck up an affair with Averell Harriman shortly after he arrived. Pamela was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, married to Randolph, his son. Kathleen arrived in London and met this lovely young woman named Pamela and quickly realized there was something going on between her and her father. And I'm sure that's a story that many people are very familiar with. But the bonds between these two families went much deeper than that. In fact, they were celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday together on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news about Pearl Harbor. After several years in London, in October 1943, FDR appointed Harriman as the ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Kathleen decided she would go with her father to Moscow. She decided to learn Russian, really for both of them, knowing that her father wouldn't have time to learn the language so that she could help understand, speak with him, even interpret in more casual settings, and she really became his right-hand man in Moscow. She was involved in everything of the day-to-day operations of the embassy, and he'd sometimes send her as his envoy in some truly incredible situations that it would be difficult for any person to stomach, and yet she did it. In the process, Kathleen became more familiar with and known to Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. When it came time for the Yalta Conference, Harriman tapped Kathleen to come with him as his aide, really in a way of that I think of as a protocol officer at the State Department today. And it was kind of one of these unsung roles where if you do your job very well, no one knows that you were even there. But for others, if it doesn't go well, all hell breaks loose. But Kathleen was really ideally suited for this role, working as a liaison between the Soviets and the American advance teams, helping bridge this cultural divide, writing about the culture and history of the local area for the American delegates that were coming over who'd never set foot in the Soviet Union before. And she was so effective in her role, not just at Yalta, but throughout her time in Moscow, that Stalin recognized this at the end of their time in Moscow. And this photograph that you see of Kathleen with a horse is not just any horse, but it was a horse that was a gift from Joseph Stalin. The third daughter was Anna Roosevelt, and at 38, and she was the only mother of the three of them, but she was also the least experienced of these three women in the world of geopolitics. She and her father had a very close relationship from the time that she was a little girl. And I love this picture of the two of them together at Campobello Island because it's one of the few that we have of FDR standing, which I think is really quite remarkable. Anna and FDR were very close when she was a little girl, and they really bonded over shared love of the environment and the natural world. Anna loved going for rides throughout their property in the Hudson River Valley, and her father would point out different varieties of trees and species of birds, and she hoped someday that she could work with him, maintaining preservation and working the land in the Hudson River Valley, kind of almost as her father's apprentice. All of this changed, of course, when FDR was struck down with polio. Suddenly, Anna found him surrounded by doctors, nurses, his political colleagues, all of whom had to come to him, and she was really shunted aside and held at an arm's length. She was sent away to school, which she hated, and then despite her parents' very progressive ideas, they insisted that she still become a debutante. This is something that Anna hated. She rejected it entirely, couldn't understand why she had to do it, but she had to nonetheless. She rebelled soon after while she was at Cornell taking a course in agriculture. She married a man when she was just 20 years old in a very, certainly a fit of rebellion. She had 2 children with him, but the marriage very quickly broke down. Shortly thereafter, she fell in love again, this time on the campaign trail while her father was running for president, this time with a Republican journalist named John Boettiger. I think in this fraught political environment, it's quite funny to think of this love story between Anna and John, and just really goes to show even on opposite sides of the political divide, love can conquer all. Anna and John got married, they moved to Seattle, had another baby, and they became the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. But in 1943, John decided to join the Army, and he shipped out to the Mediterranean. And Anna decided rather than remain in Seattle on her own, she would move her family home, and home meant the White House. Anna arrived at Christmas 1943, and she quickly began to see that something was not right about her father. He would stare off into space for long periods of time, sit there with his mouth hanging open as if he couldn't get enough air. He just wasn't as sharp with the details as she remembered him being. This is all very concerning to her. And there's little subtle changes that maybe if you lived with him and saw him every single day, you might not have noticed. But it had been several months since she'd seen him. She grew quite alarmed. She insisted he have a comprehensive medical examination, which he finally agreed to do in March of 1944. And this examination revealed that he was in fact dying of congestive heart failure. Anna was sworn to secrecy. Only she and the doctor knew the truth about his diagnosis. Eleanor couldn't really bring herself to terms with the fact that he wasn't well and really just couldn't accept this, and so she didn't know the details either. And curiously, FDR himself never once asked what was wrong with him. You can imagine perhaps with the pressures of being the president and trying to lead the country to victory in the war, the sense of your own mortality just might be too much. And so instead, the burden of the secret really fell on Anna. She became his gatekeeper in many ways in the White House, helping to determine who really needed to meet with the president and who could meet with somebody else. Sometimes she even went so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who she felt could handle them. Whether or not it was appropriate for her to be doing so, she kind of didn't really grapple with this. She really just was singularly focused on saving her father's life and giving him as much rest and relaxation under the pressures that he faced every day to whatever extent that she could. For many years, Anna had wanted to travel with her father on one of his overseas meetings, much like Sarah Churchill had done at Tehran. But FDR had always pushed her aside in those instances and instead chose to bring one of her 4 younger brothers. He turned to them largely as physical supports to help him stand and move, but Anna couldn't understand why she couldn't also come to help him. Even though FDR didn't know what was wrong with him, he sensed that Anna was doing something to protect him and that he really couldn't get along without her. She had become invaluable to him in a way that was undefined, but one that he noticed. And so finally, in January 1945, he writes to his friend Winston Churchill and says, "If you're thinking of bringing your daughter Sarah to this conference, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna." So Anna finally gets her wish after all this time since she was a little girl of yearning to be at his side and to be the person who was of the utmost importance to her father, to go with him as his primary aide at the Yalta Conference. But very tragically, Anna also knows that even though this is the culmination of a lifelong dream, it's also the last time that she will probably ever have with her father in a meaningful way. He's incredibly sick and she knows that he's dying. I love this photograph of the three daughters together at the Yalta Conference because I think a bit of their personalities shine through. You can see Sarah in her military uniform and a very smart cap and coat, Anna in the middle in a sensible tweed, and Kathleen on the end in an elegant fur coat. And each of these daughters I like to think of almost like daughter diplomats, where they aren't there in an official capacity like someone from the State Department or the Foreign Office might be, but rather they're there in a way where they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them, which allows them to go and have subtle, nuanced conversations, deliver messages that someone else might not be able to, collect information from the official but unofficial role that they occupy and report back to their fathers. They're also able to go out into the local community and meet people from the Soviet Union whose lives are literally being reordered by the conversations taking place around the conference table at that very moment. And for each of their fathers, they also represent a tangible sense of the future. There was much rhetoric at Yalta about preserving peace and securing the world for future generations and for kind of the metaphorical children. However, for each of these three leaders, their daughters really were that physical embodiment of the future that they sought to preserve through peace, which they hoped would stay. And so even though they each had their unique experiences and abilities that brought them to Yalta, I think it's this shared experience of this role of a daughter diplomat that is truly unique and one that really only they held in history. I also love the story of the three daughters who attended the Yalta Conference with their fathers because I think that it speaks to each of us in a way that we can understand. Sometimes history feels very far away and removed to people, especially something like diplomatic history or the history of foreign relations. We don't know in our own lives what it's like to negotiate across the table from Stalin. Very few people in history ever knew that. However, here, it's not so much this negotiating with Stalin, but the fact that you can connect with the story and with these women, because we all know what it's like to be somebody's parent or to be somebody's child. And at the end of the day, these individuals who are great leaders, they are also part of a family. I also think that the story is important to keep in mind now for several reasons. First, as we think about the tensions between Russia and the West, which seems like an eternal problem and one that will be with us throughout the arc of history, it's interesting to look back at the Yalta Conference and see some of the challenges that were presented there that remain with us today. FDR really believed that he could form a personal connection with Stalin, which would lead to a breakthrough in foreign relations. He had a lot of confidence in his powers of personal persuasion, and this personal connection was really successful in his relationship with Churchill and with other world leaders. However, when it came to Stalin, even if Stalin liked you and admired you, as I really believe that Stalin did admire FDR, chumminess or invitations to round of golf, that just wasn't going to change the way that he pursued his objectives in foreign relations. And so I think FDR was really led astray by this almost false hope of trying to build this personal bond with Stalin. And unfortunately, that's something that American presidents have turned to time and again and also been disappointed in more recent years. More recent administrations, for example, the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations all found challenges in trying to build this interpersonal bond with the Russian leader. I also think in the last few years we've been confronted with questions about what is the appropriate role for the family members of an elected official to play in their public lives. Family members are unelected, but of course very present in the lives of a leader, and of course you need your family often to turn to them in moments of crisis. We've seen first ladies or first spouses be involved in a way that we've kind of agreed that there is a defined role. However, the role of adult first children is different. Going all the way back to the John Quincy Adams administration, we've seen first sons play a role of principal private secretary, first daughters stepping in as first lady from time to time. But this, I think there are questions that we as Americans need to have about kind of what is the appropriate role. It's almost like when you marry someone, you marry their family, and to some extent when you elect someone, you elect their family. But what are we comfortable with? And I think maybe the model of the daughters here shows kind of how you can be effective in a way that isn't necessarily kind of outside the bounds of what a family member's duties might be. And finally, while I'm so glad that we have the technology to be able to do this and that I can speak with all of you today, that we can film this in the beautiful Park Avenue Armory, I certainly look forward to the day that we can all be back together in person. And I think this story and the commitment that the leaders had to meeting in person with Stalin despite its challenges, and also the imperative that FDR felt in creating something like the United Nations as a forum for diplomats around the world to come together, to meet in person, to understand each other and expedite these conversations of diplomacy, really speaks to the importance of meeting together in person and speaking together. So I hope that we can all get back to that very soon. But in the meantime, I'm so glad to be able to be here with you. And thank you again to the Park Avenue Armory for having me today. And I hope that you enjoy the story of these Daughters of Yalta.